Hi everyone, welcome back. So now we're going to start talking about ecological roles. All living things really fall under one of two categories in terms of how they acquire the nutrients they need to survive and reproduce. On one hand, you have autotrophs. These are living things that create their organic molecules, the lipids and carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids that they use to build their cells from inorganic resources. So there are a few different forms of this in nature. The one that we're probably more familiar with is the phototrophs. These are specific types of autotrophs that utilize sunlight to power this process. The process of taking like inorganic resources like carbon dioxide and taking the carbon out of it and rearranging it in a way that creates something new, something organic. Chemotrophs are also a type of autotroph, but instead of using sunlight as their fuel source, they use the energy trapped inside of certain chemicals, like hydrogen sulfide and things like that. On the other end of the spectrum, we have heterotrophs. These are living things that can't create their organic molecules from scratch. They can't make them from those inorganic resources that are so abundant on Earth, like phototrophs and chemotrophs do. So instead, they have to take them. They have to acquire these organic molecules in order to repurpose them, to change them, and rebuild something new. Essentially, heterotrophs are recyclers that will take organic molecules and recycle them into something different. Sometimes we call these two groups producers and consumers as well. So you'll see that written in places or referenced in this way. Producers are the producers of organic molecules. They produce their resources from scratch from those inorganic resources. So those are the autotrophs. Then the consumers are the heterotrophs. They consume resources made by producers in order to survive. And we've talked a little bit already now about different kinds of autotrophs. But the heterotrophs are also quite variable in terms of how they acquire their resources. Heterotrophs can be predators. These are the organisms that will go out and hunt and capture and kill and ultimately consume other living things, mainly other heterotrophs. Then you also have grazers. These are the organisms that mainly feed off of autotrophs or very immobile or sessile heterotrophs, things that don't really get up and move around all that much. Parasites are also heterotrophs because they are stealing organic resources, these different kinds of sugars and carbohydrates and lipids and whatnot from their hosts, usually without killing them, at least for some time. Parasites can, of course, lead to death, but there is a time period in which a parasite is feeding off of a host, not killing them. And then we also have some varieties of heterotrophs that don't eat living things, and instead they mainly feed on dead things or the waste products or loose organic matter that just gets out into the environment, not attached to a creature. So these are the decomposers and detritivores, respectively. So producers and consumers, ultimately, they all use the same resources and need the same things. They just have different methods of acquiring them. All of these living things ultimately need these building blocks of life, those biological molecules that we've talked about several times. So those are the carbohydrates, the lipids, amino acids, and nucleotides. These are the building blocks that all cells use to build everything that they need. And it's worth noting, because we're going to talk about this in a moment, that all these molecules are abundant with carbon. They are organic molecules, meaning they have a lot of carbon in them. So carbon is an abundant element on Earth. It's widespread, it's everywhere, but not all of that carbon is equally accessible to living things. A lot of it is trapped up in the soil or in rock. It's trapped in minerals. It's trapped in crystals and whatnot. in places that are impossible to access for most living things. But there is one really significant place where we find a lot of carbon, and that is in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is relatively small as a percentage of the atmosphere. It's really only less than 1% of the total atmosphere content, and that feels very small. But the atmosphere is huge. This is a lot of carbon dioxide. We're looking at gigatons, many gigatons of carbon dioxide, just like raw molecules. But this carbon dioxide is not something that is equally accessible to all forms of life. As we know, carbon dioxide really is not something that heterotrophs can access, like us. When you breathe carbon dioxide, you aren't able to use it. In fact, you produce carbon dioxide and breathe it out because it's not useful to you. Only autotrophs are able to actually utilize carbon dioxide. And so the phototrophs that do photosynthesis are making a lot of use of this. This is a process in which these organisms will take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and react it with water and sunlight and a variety of enzymes that facilitate this process to transform that, to take the carbon and rearrange it into a new form, that form being glucose, a very energy-rich carbohydrate. Essentially, we're taking the energy that we're getting from the sun and we are trapping it in some ways in this molecule that we can then use to do other things, like fuel other metabolic processes or build stuff that we need. It can also be the raw materials to build a variety of important biological molecules. So this process of photosynthesis is a really complex metabolic pathway, and it requires a lot of different enzymes to mediate and to accomplish, but this is the basics of how autotrophs, specifically those phototrophs, utilize that carbon dioxide. Chemotrophs also will change carbon, like carbon dioxide, into other things, but they just use a different power source to facilitate that. They're not using the sunlight to facilitate that. Instead, they're doing some other chemical reaction, taking the energy out of like an exothermic reaction with another chemical to power that process. So these organisms, when they produce that glucose, it can be used to do a variety of things. A lot of that glucose is used to build other important things the cell needs in order to grow and to reproduce and to do whatever it needs to do to survive. But another really important thing that glucose is used specifically for is as an energy source. All of these organisms have a shared system of metabolic reactions that can take glucose and essentially take the energy that's trapped inside of it and use that to build something that is a little bit more accessible and easier to use as an energy source. A molecule that we're probably familiar with at this point called ATP. So this is cellular respiration. The process that we're talking about here is the cellular respiration, the process of moving this energy that is trapped inside of glucose into ATP. And these reactions ultimately produce carbon dioxide very often as a byproduct, as a waste product. So this is something that autotrophs and heterotrophs do alike. All of these organisms, us included, all do respiration, all do this process of breaking down glucose, turning it into other things, oftentimes into carbon dioxide, and in the process, utilizing the energy that's inside of it. And the only difference between that is how we acquire that glucose between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs, of course, can make their own fuel source for this respiration, whereas we heterotrophs have to acquire it from somewhere. We have to steal it from somebody else or take it from the environment in the case of like a detritivore or a decomposer. But importantly, some of this carbon that is acquired and utilized by living things is stored, either temporarily or long-term, in the form of other molecules. So in the case of an autotroph, for example, when they do photosynthesis and they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They turn it into glucose. And those organisms don't have to use that glucose right away. Sometimes they can take that glucose and hold on to it and store it in one form or another, such as a starch or in glycogen in the case of a lot of heterotrophs. They can store these things to be used at a later time. They can use these resources not just as an energy source, but to build the material of a cell, to build new cells, to help the cell actually reproduce and make more of itself. And it can also be used to build compounds that are intentionally released, like, for example, specific toxins can utilize these compounds. Even the glycocalyx of bacteria that make them, those are compounds that are released by the organism and exist on the outside of the organism, and they're made of sugars. And in some long-lived organisms, carbon can remain trapped up inside them for years, sometimes even centuries, for particularly long-lived organisms, like, for example, the giant sequoia trees out west. Now, as these resources remain trapped inside of an organism, they could escape that organism and go into another one through predation or grazing. Heterotrophs can eat these autotrophs and steal their resources and integrate them into their own bodies. So this is how these heterotrophs actually acquire their resources, whether we're talking about predators, grazers, or parasites. So for example, the deer in this photo is consuming leaf matter. It has eaten leaves from a tree, and those leaves contain those resources. They contain those sugars that were made in photosynthesis. Now they belong to the deer. Similarly, this tardigrade on the right-hand side is eating an algal cell. It is also photosynthetic and is taking those resources, once it does so, from that cell, and it's going to become part of the tardigrade after that. Organisms can also die. Inevitably, living things will die. All living things. And so decomposers are a really important step in this process as well. That when an organism dies, if it isn't eaten by a predator or a grazer or things like that, those resources are taken up by specialist heterotrophs called decomposers and essentially make use of and recycle a lot of the resources that are otherwise trapped inside of that dead organism. And these resources that were stored at one point inside of that organism can then become accessible to something new. Resources that are taken up by decomposers can then be passed on to other heterotrophs if those decomposers are then eaten in turn. And so we have this complex cycle of movement of resources that are constantly being passed from one organism to the next through predation, through parasitism, through grazing. All these different interactions essentially move these resources continuously through different organisms across an environment. This, what I'm describing here, is what we call the carbon cycle. There are a lot of ways that carbon, the element, can change form and move through this environment. We can follow this in this figure here. So here's a great example. A lot of this we've already talked about. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be taken up by plants during photosynthesis and turned into sugars. Those sugars can be grazed on by animals and become part of those animals. Plants and animals alike can do respiration that can take those sugars and turn them back into carbon dioxide, going back into the environment. It is also possible for this material to enter into the soil and become organic carbon, in which case those detritivores that I mentioned before will love to eat these things. Then those detritivores can do respiration to release it as carbon dioxide, or it can be eaten by something else and eventually make its way up the food chain into something different. You could also have, of course, things die and decay, and decomposers can get at them and continue that cycle. Or in some cases, the the carbon can actually become buried and trapped and become changed over time. It can undergo what we call a chemical decomposition, where it's not broken down by living things, but instead a chemical reaction in the environment. Essentially, it turns into something very different, not through biological means. And so this is actually how things like fossil fuels can be formed. That organic matter that contains a lot of carbon can break down and change form and become fossil fuels. Call them fossil fuels, of course, because they're made of dead organisms, past organic matter from animals and plants alike. And then, of course, if we wanted to, we could take these fossil fuels and then burn them. We use that, of course, to power various processes, but then we release all of those carbons that were trapped inside of these fossil fuels as carbon dioxide, continuing that cycle. So currently, the Earth's carbon dioxide output is greater than the amount of carbon that is being fixed from the atmosphere, that is being taken up by something and stored in like solid organic matter. And a lot of that is due to us actively burning those fossil fuels. We are taking a lot of this long stored carbon out of the earth that was once buried, and we're burning it, putting it back out into the atmosphere. So we're increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're also doing other problematic things, like we're destroying a lot of forests in the environment that are also places where carbon is stored in different forms. And that's not helping much either. So it's important to note that this cycle, the components of the cycle are not perfectly equal. You can push these things out of balance to reduce the availability, the amount of some compound like carbon dioxide, for example. You can make that more abundant or less abundant through our actions, and also the ecological behaviors of other organisms in the environment. What different organisms like us are doing. So this whole concept is the basis of something that we call nutrient cycling, which really occurs in all of these biologically important nutrients in some form. Whether we're talking about phosphorus or oxygen or nitrogen, what have you. And so we have this movement of nutrients that pass through different forms over the course of time. It's cyclical, meaning that these resources will move in various ways between organisms and their environment, between different parts of the environment, between multiple different organisms being passed from one to the next, and of course in different molecular configurations. Ultimately being able to return back to that original form. In some situations, a nutrient might be unavailable to something. Just like in carbon dioxide's case, that carbon is not available to heterotrophs like us. It is inaccessible or unavailable to certain organisms or to all of them. In other situations, nutrients are going to become available. So when carbon is transferred into a glucose molecule, suddenly that carbon is accessible to many forms of life, to really all forms of life. So we're going to explore one more nutrient cycle here. It's quite important. It's called the nitrogen cycle. So we're going to look at how microbes especially are moving nitrogen through an environment. So in the environment, nitrogen is actually really abundant as nitrogen gas. So whereas carbon dioxide was something like 0.4%, it was like less than 1% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen gas is like 70-something percent. It's quite high. It's very abundant and makes up the majority of the atmosphere. But The problem is that nitrogen gas is an inaccessible form of nitrogen for most forms of life. These are molecules that are very difficult to break apart, and the vast majority of organisms don't have the metabolic pathways, the enzymes, to facilitate that job. However, some bacteria have figured this out, and they do have specialized enzymes to facilitate this process. So when bacteria take nitrogen and convert it into a more usable form, in this case ammonia, NH3, they are doing something that we call nitrogen fixation. They are fixing nitrogen, meaning they're taking it and making it into a form that is more accessible for some forms of life. So as with many metabolic processes, nitrogen fixation is a process that takes a lot of steps and a lot of energy. It's mediated by a special enzyme these bacteria make called nitrogenase. And it's very energetically taxing. It actually requires a lot of ATP. It requires 16 ATP molecules for just one molecule of nitrogen gas to be fixed to make it into NH3, right? So that's a really energy taxing reaction that takes place here. Now these reactions are what we call chemotrophic, okay? Chemotrophic. So they are involved in making these special chemicals. So there's actually a lot of different bacteria that are what we call diazotrophs. These are the nitrogen fixers. And many of these organisms are free living, meaning they just live freely in the environment. They're not associated with anyone. They don't engage in pathogenic behavior. They're not opportunistic pathogens or specialist pathogens. A lot of them are cyanobacteria and are also capable of photosynthesis. But some of these organisms are also mutualistic, meaning that they have a partnership with other living things, some other organism. And it's really cool because being able to make an accessible form of nitrogen is very useful for a lot of organisms who otherwise don't have the ability to do that. And so this creates an opportunity to trade with other species for other resources that maybe you don't have in abundance. This is where the mutualism comes in. So nitrogen is really important for living things. It's a critical part of our proteins and nucleic acids. We can't make them without that. And so nitrogen is so important that it can be used as a resource to facilitate these interspecies relationships and drive species to be more friendly with one another. In this case, we have some species of bacteria called rhizobia. We call them rhizobia, that have partnered with plants, specifically the legumes, right? So peas and beans and things like that, where they live together and readily trade products for one another. So in this case, both of these organisms can make things that the other needs. Legumes, these are plants, they are photosynthetic, they make sugars, glucose. Those are things that the rhizobia cannot readily make. The rhizobia are nitrogen fixers. They make ammonia that the legumes cannot readily make. So they trade with each other happily to essentially get the best of both worlds. Now, in the form of ammonia, nitrogen-fixing bacteria can actually utilize that nitrogen. They take the nitrogen gas, they convert it into ammonia, and then they can take that ammonia and do things with it. It's also then very accessible to some plants as well. Not all plants, but some. So these organisms can then incorporate this nitrogen into some of those essential biological molecules that require it, like the amino acids, like the nucleotides that build our proteins and nucleic acids, respectively. Some other organisms can eat those bacteria, stealing those molecules that have lots of nitrogen in them. Other organisms can access those ammonia molecules using that to build their own resources. They don't just have to utilize the organic molecules the bacteria make. They could also utilize just the ammonia itself. However, Some of these organisms can't use ammonia. They can't use NH3. They have to take that NH3 and convert it into something in order for it to be usable to them. This is where nitrification comes in. So this is a process by which some bacteria will strip off those hydrogens and attach lots of oxygens to them. And these bacteria can use that to produce nitrates and nitrites, otherwise known as NO3 and NO2. These are the ammonia oxidizers, the group of bacteria and archaea that will do this process. Some of these groups will only convert ammonia into nitrite, only into NO2. And so a secondary step is then needed in order to move it up to NO3, into a nitrate compound. So this is one major way that a lot of plants, not just legumes, get access to their nitrogen. Now, once nitrogen has been incorporated into an organism, it's readily changing forms. These organisms are going to break that stuff down and turn it into some other kind of nitrogen-rich molecule and then repurpose it into something else. That material can also be released as waste that you will pee or poop it out, but it also is something that can be lost through a variety of ways, but also just simply through dying. That organisms can die or they can shed dead cells. Those materials can be lost and released into the environment in one form or another. We need this in order to build all of our amino acids that our proteins are based off of. Just like we need it to build all of our nucleotides that our DNA and RNA are based off of. And we can actually turn some of these amino acids into other amino acids as we need. So we can actually recycle some of these things. If we have them in one form and we don't need them as much in that one form, we can convert them into another. There are some species that have what we call essential amino acids, things that we cannot make ourselves, and we need to acquire them in that specific form. And then we also have non-essential amino acids that we don't have to get in our diet, and we can just make them metabolically ourselves. And that is something that can vary from species to species. So bacteria and fungi are taking these resources that are lost in the environment, or taking the resources from dead things and decomposing them, breaking them down into some other form. A lot of these organisms are doing what we call ammonification. This is the breakdown of nitrogen-rich compounds into ammonia. So we're actually taking things like nitrates and nitrites, and also other materials that are like amino acids and things like that, and we're reacting them, breaking them down into ammonia instead of some other compound. This is breaking them down into an earlier state in this nitrogen cycle. There's a lot of reasons why organisms might do this. One of the big ones is that it can be a chemotrophic kind of process where it can fuel the reaction of something else. So a common path that we see in bacteria a lot for nitrogen is the fixation of nitrogen gas into ammonia, then the nitrification of ammonia into nitrates and nitrites, and then the consumption of that resource, turn it into something useful like a protein or things like that. Then it can be moved up the food web by being eaten by something else, or it could be excreted as waste, oftentimes broken down into ammonia. However, there are also several ways to return nitrogen back into the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. Some bacteria will actually utilize those nitrates and nitrites in other metabolic processes that will take these molecules and strip away those oxygens, leaving them only with N2 gas that can then be released into the environment. So these are the denitrifiers, doing the thing that we call denitrification. And the really curious thing is that also sometimes we have nitrifiers, species that will take ammonia and react it to form those nitrates and nitrites, that are also denitrifiers. They will take those nitrates and nitrites and react them to produce nitrogen gas. So this is the nitrogen cycle. And so this is a good representation of that really shows how these resources move through the environment. Just to recap, we can have nitrogen gas in the atmosphere that can be taken up by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria can react it to form ammonia that can then utilize those nitrogen-rich ammonia molecules or continue with that reaction. That you can have nitrifiers that utilize those ammonia molecules to produce nitrates and nitrites, and then you could have denitrifying bacteria that convert those nitrates and nitrites all the way over into nitrogen gas. And this process can be interrupted at any point by living things to be utilized in the form of organic nitrogen-rich molecules. Now, these cycles occur through the actions of different organisms. Essentially, organisms just living their lives, doing their unique behaviors, their specific metabolic abilities. And in the process, other organisms can benefit or be otherwise impacted by that behavior. In the case of something like a nitrogen fixer doing its thing, it's just living its life, taking nitrogen gas and reacting it to form ammonia. But that happens to be really good for a lot of other organisms. Similarly, organisms that are doing denitrification, that are taking nitrates and nitrites and reacting them to form nitrogen gas, that might not be as good for other living things because it's making those resources less available. The sum of these interactions is really what we talk about when we discuss the ecology of these organisms. It's the interactions that take place in this environment and their respective impact on one another. I want to remind you all that this is something that is not just a macroscopic phenomenon. It's really easy to think that all of this stuff really just affects big organisms like plants and people and deer and wolves and things like that. But we are talking about all living things, even and especially bacteria and fungi and archaea and other microscopic life.